The stage came into Coldwater Bend on a Thursday late, with the first hard cold of the year riding in behind it, and the woman who stepped down from it had been spoken about before her foot ever touched the boardwalk. Adeline Frost was 25 years old. She carried a single carpet bag and a flat wooden case of slates and primers tied with twine. And she set them both down on the planking in front of the depot and stood a moment to let her eyes adjust to a town that had already decided what she was. Word travels faster than a stage on that stretch of country, and a letter had come ahead of her from the place she'd taught last, a folded, careful letter from a man who had wanted something she would not give and had named her a liar when she refused. So the people of Coldwater Bend looked at her the way people look at a thing they have been warned about. A few women by the dry goods window leaned their heads together. The depot agent took her name in his book without meeting her eye. And Adeline Frost, who had crossed 300 miles on the strength of a teaching post that the letter had quietly cost her before she arrived, folded her hands at her waist, lifted her chin to the level it had held all her life, and did not let it drop. She had learned a long time ago that another person's measure of her was not the truth. It was only the loudest thing in the room. There was no post for her now. The school board had read the letter and sent its regrets by way of the postmaster, who had the decency at least to look ashamed handing it over. She had $11 and a case of children's primers, and nowhere in the world she was expected. She found a bench under the depot eave and sat with her back straight and her bag at her feet while the town went about deciding she was no concern of theirs, and the cold came down off the ridge the way it does in late October, taking the last of the color out of the hills. Across the rutted street, in the wide doorway of a wheelwright's shop, a man stood wiping a wood shaving from the curve of a wheel rim and watching her without seeming to. Caleb Wren was 34. He was broad through the back from a trade that asked it of him, quiet in a way that the town had stopped trying to fill with talk. And he had buried his wife 2 winters past, and had not been the same easy man since. He had a boy. The boy was 7 and had not said a word any soul could swear to since his mother died, not at the table, not at play, not when spoken to kindly, nor when spoken to sharp. Folks had stopped expecting him to. Caleb watched the schoolteacher sit alone in the cold with her chin up and her case of primers at her feet, and he watched the town walk past her, and something in him that had gone still a long while turned over once. He set the wheel rim against the wall. He crossed the street. He stopped a careful distance off, the way a man stops who does not want to be mistaken for crowding a woman. And he said, "I hear you teach letters." Adeline looked up at him. "I did," she said. "I'm told I no longer do." Caleb turned his hat once in his hands. "I've got a boy," he said. "He doesn't talk. Hasn't. Going on 2 years. I'm not asking you to fix that. I don't reckon it can be bought or taught. But he ought to know his letters, and I can't sit still long enough to teach him. And there's nobody else who will come out to the place." He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has already decided is right and sees no need to ornament. There's a back room off the shop with a stove in it, room and board. You teach him his letters of a morning, and the rest of your day is your own, until you've sorted what comes next. He did not look at her past, and he did not ask after it. That more than anything he said was what she answered. "I can teach a boy his letters," Adeline said, "and I'm not afraid of work." She stood and gathered her case. "I'll want to meet him first, before either of us decides." Caleb Wren almost smiled at that, almost the corner of it, and said that seemed fair, and carried her bag, though she had not asked him to. The back room was small and clean and smelled of cut oak. There was a cot, a stove, a window that looked west toward the ridge, and a shelf by the window where she set the case of primers, and, on top of it, a single worn hornbook, a child's paddle of wood with the alphabet under a sheet of horn, scratched and thumbed soft at the handle, that she had carried since she was small and had taught from in 3 towns. She set it on the shelf where the last light would find it, and that was where it lived. The boy was named Tobias. He stood in the shop doorway behind his father's leg and looked at her with his mother's eyes and said nothing, and Adeline did not crouch and coo at him the way strangers did, which he plainly hated. She only said, "Good evening, Tobias. I'm Miss Frost. We'll start tomorrow, and we'll go slow." Tobias said nothing. But he did not look away either, and Caleb noted that without comment. They began the next morning. Adeline did not push the boy to speak because she understood that silence is sometimes the only wall a small person has left standing, and you do not knock down a wall a child is sheltering behind. She put the hornbook in front of him and traced the letters with her finger and made the sounds soft and unhurried, and asked nothing of him but that he watch. He watched. The following morning he traced an A with his own finger once and looked quickly to see if she had made anything of it, and she had not, and so he did it again. By the end of the first week he would take the chalk from her without being handed it. The warmth came in the way it comes, sideways and without announcement. Coffee was on the stove before she rose, and she knew Caleb had built the fire before light because the room was already warm and he was already out in the shop with the bellows going. The loose plank in the back step that had caught her heel was planed flat and re-nailed one afternoon while she taught, and neither of them said a word about it. She mended the boy's coat where the elbow had gone through and set it back on its hook, and Caleb saw it and said nothing, only nodded once to himself the way a man does over a thing that pleases him more than he means to show. She found, too, that the man cooked plainly and ate little, and so she began keeping a plate back for him against the long hours he worked past dark, covered with a cloth on the warm shelf above the stove, and the first morning the plate came back empty and rinsed, and set by the basin she understood it for the thanks it was. By the end of the second week he had stopped knocking before he came into the kitchen of an evening, which is a small thing and was not a small thing, and she marked it the way she marked the boy's letters, quietly and without making more of it than it was. She learned the shape of his grief by the careful spaces he kept around it. There was a chair at the table no one sat in. There was a tin daguerreotype on the mantel of a young woman with a plain, kind face, and Caleb dusted it himself and let no one else touch it. Adeline asked nothing. She only kept the house warm and the lessons steady, and let the man and the boy come toward her at whatever pace the cold let them. 3 weeks on, Tobias began leaving things for her, a smooth stone on the shelf by the hornbook, a feather, once a sprig of dried yarrow, small offerings laid where she would find them, asking nothing, the way his father fixed steps and built fires. She thanked him for each, plainly, and made no more of it than it was, and the boy's shoulders came down a little further every time. By the 5th week he would sit against her knee while she read, and she could feel him follow the words with his whole still body, and Caleb took to standing in the shop doorway of an evening with a wheel half finished in his hands, listening, until the dark made him light the lamp. Then, on a gray morning near the end of October, with frost thick on the fence rails, it happened, and it happened the way the truest things do, with no warning and no fuss. Adeline had the horn book out and was tracing a word she had built for him from the letters he knew. A small word, 4 letters, the one she had been quietly walking him toward for a week. She traced it and made no sound, and waited. And Tobias put his finger under the first letter and moved it along the row, and in a voice rusted from 2 years of disuse, thin and uncertain and entirely his own. He read it aloud. Home, he said it once. Then he looked up at her, frightened of what he had done, and Adeline did not gasp or weep or gather him up, because she understood that the moment was his and not hers to make a spectacle of. She only said quietly, "Yes, that's the word. You read it true." And from the shop doorway, where Caleb Rand had gone perfectly still with a spoke half set in his hand, came no sound at all. He set the spoke down. He went back to the bench. But that night he left the lamp burning longer than the work needed, and when Adeline passed the doorway he said, without turning, "Thank you." And she understood it was the largest thing he had said to anyone in 2 years, and she answered it the way it was given, plainly, and let it be. The warmth might have grown on quietly all winter if the town had let it, but a town that has decided a thing about a woman does not like to be proven wrong, and there was a woman in Coldwater Bend named Hessie Vaughn who had a voice built for carrying and a memory for other people's faults. She had heard, the way such women always hear, the contents of the letter that came ahead of the school teacher, and she had been saving it. She let it out at the dry goods counter on a Saturday with half the town in to trade, loud enough to reach the street, that the Wren place had taken in a woman run out of her last post for loose conduct, that there was a man back east who'd name her a liar and worse, that a widower with a motherless boy ought to think harder about who he set by his stove. The words went through the town like cold through a thin wall. By the time Adeline walked in for thread on Monday, the warmth had pulled back from her like water before a frost, the nods gone, the doorways quieter, the children's mothers steering wide. She bought her thread and paid for it and kept her chin level, because she had stood in this weather before and knew it did not kill you if you did not bend to it. But it was not only Hessie Vaughn's tongue. The letter had named a man, and 3 days later that man rode into Coldwater Bend in a good coat on a hired horse. His name was Silas Pruitt, and he had been a school trustee in the town Adeline taught last, and he had wanted her, and she had told him no, and he had spent the month since making certain that no would cost her everything a no could cost. He had ridden a long way to watch it land. He found her on Main Street on a Wednesday, with the freight wagons in and most of the town about. And he did it loud, the way Hessie Vaughn had done it, because shame is only a weapon if there is a crowd to wield it before. He said she owed him money he claimed she'd taken, a debt he'd invented, the fare he'd advanced her 2 years gone. He said a woman of her character had no business teaching anyone's child, and that he had come to collect what was his and take her back where she could be watched. He said the word the letter had only hinted out loud in the street, and the town drew in close to see what she would do. Adeline Frost stood with her hands folded and did not move, and did not give him the spectacle he had ridden 300 miles for. But her stillness would not have been enough alone, and she knew it, and that was the cold truth of a frontier town, that a woman's word, however straight her back, weighed nothing against a well-dressed man's in front of a crowd that wanted to believe the worst. Then a shadow came up the boardwalk and stopped at her shoulder. Caleb Wren had crossed the street again, the way he had the first day, and he had a folded paper in one hand and a small iron cash box under his arm. The box he kept on the high shelf in the shop, the one Adeline had dusted and never opened. The savings of 2 hard years that everyone in town knew he was hoarding toward a proper house off the back of the shop. A house with rooms enough for a family. He did not raise his voice, because he had never needed to. "This man says she owes a debt," Caleb said to the street, plainly, so they would all hear it. "I've read his paper. It's a lie a man wrote to punish a woman for telling him no. But a lie can be paid like a debt, if paying it is what buys her free of him." He set the cash box on the rain barrel by the rail and opened it and counted out. Into Silas Pruitt's hand, every coin of 2 years' careful saving, the whole of the house he had meant to build. The crowd went very quiet. "That clears the fare, the fee, and every excuse you rode in with," Caleb said. "It does not buy her. It frees her from you. There's nothing of yours left in this town, and there's nothing here for you. Now go." Silas Pruitt looked at the money in his hand, and at the man who had given it without flinching, and at the town that had gone over all at once to the side of the woman with the level chin. For nothing turns a crowd like a decent man spending everything he has. And he found he had no more words that would carry. He pocketed the coins because a small man always does, and he got on his hired horse, and he rode out the way he came, and the dust settled behind him and did not rise again. Hessie Vaughn was not at the dry goods counter the next morning, nor for several mornings after. When at last she spoke of it, she said only that she supposed she'd been told wrong, which was as near to an apology as her sort ever comes, and the town, ashamed of how readily it had leaned the other way, let the matter close. The cold came on toward Christmas, and the warmth came back into the Wren place and stayed. Caleb said nothing about the empty cash box. The house off the back of the shop went unbuilt, and he seemed easier for it, as though he'd spent the money on the thing he'd truly wanted all along and only just learned it. It was Adeline who finally spoke of what lay between them, because she had learned that some things a quiet man will carry forever rather than presume. She found him in the shop one evening with the lamp low and Tobias asleep by the stove, and she said, "You spent your house on me." Caleb turned a spoke in his hands. "I spent it on the truth getting said," he said. "The house was only ever going to be walls. I'd sooner have the people that go in it." Then he set the spoke down and turned, and looked at her the way he had not let himself look at anyone in 2 years, and he said it plainly, on her terms, with no ornament at all. "I'd like you to stay, Adeline, as my wife, if that's what you want. The boy needs you. So do I. But it's yours to say, and I'll not ask you twice nor crowd you to it." Adeline Frost let the silence stand, because it was hers now to feel or not. And she had spent her whole life having other people decide what she was, and she meant to decide this one herself, in her own time, with no one's voice in the room but her own. The fire ticked. The wind came down off the ridge and found the seams of the shop and did not get in. She thought of the bench at the depot and the $11 and the long road behind her. And she thought of a small rusted voice reading the word home off a worn horn book. And she found that she had decided, perhaps, a good while before he asked. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." They were married in the small church at the foot of the ridge 2 weeks before Christmas, with frost on the windows and Tobias standing up beside his father in a mended coat. And the same town that had watched her humiliated stood now and watched her chosen, and had the grace, most of it, to be glad. Adeline Wren kept teaching, not in a school the board could take from her, but at her own table, where the children of Coldwater Bend came of a morning to learn their letters off a worn wooden hornbook. The same one that had crossed 300 miles in a case of primers and now lived on a shelf by the west window where the last light found it every evening. Tobias spoke a little more each season, in his own time, never to perform and never on command, but at the table and in the yard, and once, that first Christmas, to ask his father a question that made Caleb set down his coffee and go quiet a long moment before he answered it. And on winter evenings, with the supper cleared and the boy bent over a slate and the cold held off beyond the warm walls, Caleb Wren would sit by the stove with a half-finished wheel forgotten in his hands and listen to his wife read, and find he had everything a man could want, and most of it he had nearly let pass him by on a Thursday in the cold. And that was the story of Adeline Frost, a woman the world had tried to name a liar, who arrived in a hard town with a bag and a case of children's primers and a spine that would not bend, and who taught a silent boy his letters and a grieving man to hope, and in the doing was finally seen for exactly who she was. Tell me in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.